The evening was alive with glittering lights and soft music, casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom. Guests in sparkling dresses and sharp suits moved around gracefully, holding glasses that reflected the chandelier's brilliance. The air smelled of expensive perfume and fine food, with laughter and polite conversation blending into a warm hum. It was the kind of party that seemed impossible for someone like her to be a part of. Yet here she was, carrying trays of drinks and small bites, weaving between the crowd with practiced ease. She had spent years working in small cafes and diners, always moving quickly, always keeping a smile ready, even when the day had been long and tiring. Tonight, she wore her best uniform, a neat black dress, hair pulled back, shoes polished. She didn't need to stand out. Her job was to blend in, to make sure others were enjoying themselves. The guests barely noticed her, though some nodded politely or smiled when she passed by. She had learned early that in places like this, the most important skill was invisibility. She could serve champagne, refill glasses, and carry heavy trays without anyone giving her a second thought. And that was exactly how she liked it. The work was hard, but honest, and it paid the bills. But even as she moved through the crowd, there was a quiet part of her that longed for something more, something beyond the clinking glasses and whispered conversations. She had always loved music. Even when she was a little girl, she would sit by the piano in her small home and let her fingers dance across the keys. It had been her secret world, a place where she could escape from the noise of life and express herself. Music made her feel alive in a way that nothing else could. But dreams like that seemed far away now. Life had a way of asking her to focus on the practical, the necessary, the things that kept food on the table and rent paid. The piano in her parents' old living room had been sold years ago, and she hadn't played in front of anyone but herself in a long time. Yet, deep down, she still remembered every note, every rhythm, every emotion that had once flowed freely from her fingertips. The crowd was getting louder, more animated as the night went on. Servers moved quickly, dodging between guests and keeping trays full. She balanced hers carefully, stepping around a tall man in a navy suit, and caught sight of a woman laughing so hard that her champagne nearly spilled. She smiled quietly to herself. These people lived in a world she could never quite touch, a world of wealth and comfort and endless parties. She had heard stories about the host before, a man who enjoyed the finer things, who had a reputation for being a little cruel when it amused him. People said he liked to make others feel small, to remind them of where they belonged in the social ladder. She had only seen him from afar, a tall figure with sharp eyes and a confident grin, moving through the room as if he owned it. Most guests greeted him with deference, knowing better than to joke or challenge him. Tonight, she just hoped to do her job quietly and get through the evening without being noticed. As she reached the edge of the room, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres, a hand suddenly grabbed her elbow. She turned, startled, to see the host himself looking down at her with an unreadable expression. His presence was commanding, a mixture of charm and intimidation that made it hard to think straight. "You there," he said, voice smooth but with a sharp edge. "Come here for a moment." Her heart sank. She tried to keep her smile in place, nodded, and followed him, clutching the tray tightly. The guests around them didn't notice. They were too busy with their conversations and laughter. He led her to the grand piano at the center of the room, the polished black surface reflecting the chandelier's lights. Her stomach twisted as she saw the curious looks from the few nearby guests. Though most were still engrossed in their own socializing, he motioned for her to sit on the bench, a smirk playing on his lips. She hesitated, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Play something," he said casually, as if asking for a favor. But there was a subtle, unmistakable tone in his voice that made her uneasy. The way he said it carried the promise that this was not a suggestion. She shook her head slightly, trying to find her voice. I don't be shy," he interrupted, leaning back with a look of amusement. "I just want to hear what you've got. Surely it can't be that hard. Everyone here is curious to see the waitress try her hand at the piano. It'll be entertaining." His eyes glinted with a mixture of challenge and mockery. She swallowed hard, the tray in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. She knew this wasn't a genuine interest in music. It was a setup, a chance for him and the guests to have a laugh at her expense. She had faced difficult customers and demanding employers before, but this was different. This was a room full of people expecting her to fail, and she could feel their anticipation like a physical weight pressing down on her. Despite the fear, she forced herself to step closer to the piano. She set the tray down carefully on a nearby table, took a deep breath, and sat on the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, cold and uncertain. She could hear the soft murmurs of the guests, a mixture of curiosity and quiet amusement. Her heart pounded, and her hands shook slightly. Memories of her childhood lessons, of late nights practicing alone, of the feeling of music flowing through her veins, surged up inside her. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes and let herself remember that feeling, the one that had made her dream of a life beyond waiting tables. The host's smirk grew wider. "Well," he asked, his tone dripping with impatience. "Show us what you can do." She opened her eyes, took another deep breath, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note she played was tentative, careful, almost shy, but it carried a clarity that drew the room's attention. People stopped talking, glancing over to see the waitress at the piano. She felt every eye on her, the pressure building, yet something inside her clicked. She began to play a simple melody, letting her fingers move as if they remembered everything she had ever learned. The sound filled the room softly at first, almost like a whisper, but it had a purity that was undeniable. The guests leaned in, some curious, some skeptical, others already sensing that this might be more than a joke. The host's eyes narrowed slightly. He had expected stumbling, embarrassment, maybe even a laugh, but the music that flowed from her hands was delicate, precise, and surprisingly confident. It was clear that she had skill, though she moved as if unaware of how impressive it truly was. The contrast between her modest appearance and the beauty of the music created a strange tension in the room. People shifted in their seats, their amusement fading into fascination. She could feel it, the change in the air, the shift in attention, and it gave her a quiet, growing sense of courage. Still, she didn't dare let herself feel triumphant. Not yet. She continued to play, letting the music guide her, each note a small act of defiance against the ridicule she expected. The guests, sensing something extraordinary, began to pay closer attention, their whispers turning to appreciative murmurs. The host, once so confident, now watched with an expression that was harder to read. The game he had planned was slipping from his control, and for the first time, the power in the room felt shared rather than dictated entirely by wealth and status. Her mind, once clouded with fear and doubt, began to clear. The music reminded her of who she really was, of the years spent secretly dreaming, of the moments when she had allowed herself to imagine something bigger. The ballroom, the laughter, the sparkling lights, all of it seemed to fade into the background as her fingers found the rhythm, the melody, the emotion she had thought lost. And in that moment, she realized something important. No one could take her talent away. No one could diminish the music that lived within her. She had always had it, and tonight, even in a room full of strangers, she could show it. The first part of the evening had shifted, slowly, subtly. She had taken her place at the piano, uncertain and afraid, yet ready to begin something she hadn't allowed herself to share for years. The guests began to notice, the atmosphere changing from casual amusement to quiet expectation. And though she didn't know it yet, this simple act, this decision to play despite fear, would mark the beginning of a night that none of them would forget. She sat on the polished bench, her fingers resting lightly on the black and white keys. The grand piano gleamed under the soft chandelier light, a silent witness to the tension in the room. Her heart raced, and she felt a knot in her stomach as the eyes of the crowd turned toward her. She had imagined moments like this many times, but never in a room full of strangers, never under the gaze of someone who intended to mock her. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves, but the weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders. The host leaned casually against the piano, his arms crossed, wearing a smile that was both challenging and mocking. He spoke in a low voice that only she could hear. "Just show them what a waitress can do. Let's see if your talent is real or just a dream." She ignored him, letting the music take over instead of his words. She had learned long ago that the best way to survive such situations was to focus on the task, not the judgment. Her fingers began to move slowly, producing a soft, tentative melody. The notes were careful at first, almost as if testing the waters, but there was a hint of something more beneath them. The guests, who had been talking and laughing, began to quiet down. Some leaned forward slightly, curious to see what would happen next. A few glanced at each other with subtle surprise, sensing that this might not be the embarrassment they had expected. She could feel their attention, heavy and watchful, but instead of fear, a small spark of courage began to ignite within her. The melody grew, each note more confident than the last. Her fingers danced across the keys with a familiarity that came from years of private practice. Though she had never shared her music in a public space like this, The sound filled the room, soft at first, then swelling with a gentle power that caught the guests off guard. Their conversations had stopped entirely now, replaced by the soft hum of the piano. Even the host's expression began to shift. He had expected hesitation, uncertainty, a fumble or two. What he saw instead was grace, poise, and undeniable skill. She allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, feeling the music flow through her. It had been too long since she had played freely, without worry, without expectation. Each chord carried a memory from her childhood, each note a piece of her soul she had kept hidden for so long. She let herself feel it fully, and in that feeling, she found strength. The audience might have been waiting for a failure, but she had no intention of giving them one. This was her music, her moment, and no one could take that from her. The melody shifted into something more complex, fingers moving faster, the sound more confident. She noticed a few people leaning closer to listen, their expressions a mix of surprise and admiration. The chatter of the room had completely faded, replaced by the resonance of the piano. Even the waiters moving through the crowd paused for a moment, captivated by the sound. Her nerves had not vanished, but they had transformed into focus. Every key she pressed felt like a brushstroke painting a picture, each phrase telling a story. She realized she was no longer just playing to survive the moment. She was playing to express herself, to be seen for who she truly was. The host's smirk was gone now. He watched silently, trying to mask his surprise. But it was clear that the music had caught him off guard. He had expected a moment of mockery, a few giggles, and then his entertainment would continue. Instead, he found himself confronting a talent he had not anticipated. His presence still loomed, still intimidating, but it no longer had the power to dominate the room. The music had shifted the focus, and she felt a quiet thrill in that realization. A small cluster of guests moved closer, their eyes wide with appreciation. Whispers of astonishment began to ripple through the room, soft at first, then growing. "She's incredible," one guest murmured. "Where did she learn to play like that?" The curiosity and admiration were tangible, filling the space with energy that was different from the laughter and mockery that had been there before. She couldn't see everyone's face, but she could sense the change in mood, the shift from expectation of failure to admiration for skill. Her fingers moved faster now, gliding across the keys with precision and emotion. She had never played for an audience like this before, yet something deep inside her responded instinctively. The music was no longer just notes. It was a conversation, a story unfolding in real time. She thought of all the times she had played in solitude, imagining herself on a stage, sharing her music with others. That dream, once distant, now felt tangible. The energy in the room, the surprise and admiration, gave her a quiet sense of power she had never known before. The host shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He had intended this to be a source of amusement, but the tables had turned. The room was silent, every ear focused on the piano. He could no longer control the narrative. She was in charge now, commanding the attention of every guest. For a moment, he seemed almost reflective, realizing that the assumptions he had made about her based on her appearance and occupation were entirely wrong. She was far more than a waitress. She was an artist, a storyteller, a presence that demanded respect. She felt the music rise and fall, each note carrying intention and emotion. The melody was rich, layered with dynamics she hadn't played for anyone in years. She was aware of the audience, but no longer intimidated. Instead, she felt a connection with them, a shared understanding that transcended the usual barriers of wealth and status. For a brief, shining moment, the room was united not by who people were or what they had, but by the beauty of the music itself. It was as if the piano had become a bridge, linking her world to theirs in a way words never could. Time seemed to stretch, the piece growing in intensity. Her hands moved with confidence now, each chord ringing with clarity, each passage flowing seamlessly into the next. The room seemed to hold its breath, captivated by the transformation. People who had been ready to laugh were now leaning in, silent and attentive, caught up in the elegance and power of her playing. She could feel their eyes, yes, but she had learned to let the music guide her, to focus on the story she wanted to tell through sound rather than the judgments of strangers. As she approached the climax of the piece, she felt a surge of emotion, a combination of joy, relief, and pride. She had stepped into the unknown, faced fear and ridicule, and emerged with something beautiful. Each note carried a message, each phrase a declaration that she was more than anyone had expected. The music soared, filling every corner of the ballroom, vibrating through the floor and walls. reaching the ears and hearts of all who listened. It was no longer just a performance. It was a revelation. Finally, she played the last note, letting it linger in the air like a gentle whisper. The room was silent for a heartbeat, the resonance fading slowly. Then, almost simultaneously, applause erupted. It was immediate, genuine, and loud, echoing off the walls and filling the space with energy. People were smiling, some with hands over their mouths in awe, others standing to offer their praise. She felt a warm rush of emotion, a mix of relief and elation. The fear that had gripped her moments ago seemed distant now, replaced by a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. The host remained at the piano, his expression unreadable. There was no smirk now, no trace of mockery. Instead, there was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the fact that he had misjudged her entirely. He had expected a moment of humor at her expense, but what he had witnessed was undeniable skill and poise. The power dynamic in the room had shifted subtly, but irrevocably. She was no longer just a waitress serving drinks. She was someone who had the courage to step forward and show her true self. Guests began to approach her, offering compliments and congratulations. Questions were asked about where she had learned to play, how long she had been practicing, and whether she had considered performing publicly. Each interaction added to her growing sense of confidence and self-worth. She realized that this night, which had begun with fear and humiliation, had transformed into a turning point. Her music had broken through the social barriers, allowing her talent and dedication to shine in a way that could not be ignored. As she stepped away from the piano, a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration washing over her, she understood something profound. Fear and expectation can be heavy, but courage and talent have a way of breaking through. She had faced ridicule, but in doing so, she had revealed something extraordinary not just to the guests, but to herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope that perhaps her dreams were not so far away after all. The applause continued to echo in the grand room, and she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself a small smile, though her hands still hovered above the keys as if waiting for permission to play again. But the applause was genuine. She could feel the sincerity in the way people leaned toward her, their eyes wide with admiration and awe. No one laughed. No one whispered cruel comments. Instead, she was met with attention and curiosity she had never experienced before. The contrast from a few minutes ago, when the host had planned to embarrass her, was astonishing. The host finally stepped forward, removing his lean against the piano. His expression was no longer smug, but guarded, almost like a man realizing he had miscalculated. He clapped, slowly at first, then joined the rest of the guests. There was a tension in the room, but it had shifted from judgment to anticipation. Some guests whispered to each other, their words carrying surprise and intrigue. They had not expected her to play like that, and the performance had completely changed their perception of her. She took a steadying breath and let her fingers touch the keys again. She was no longer hesitant. The first few notes were deliberate and sure, carrying confidence that had not been there before. She played a soft passage, delicate and gentle, yet each note was clear and purposeful. The audience leaned closer, captivated by her skill. Even the host, who had expected mockery, now seemed to be watching intently, as if trying to understand how someone so unassuming could create such music. It was a strange, quiet moment, the kind that made the whole room feel suspended. Held in the space between one note and the next, her mind drifted briefly to the small piano at home, the one she had played in her childhood, the one that had first awakened her love for music. She remembered sitting for hours, teaching herself pieces, listening to every note carefully, perfecting the tiniest details. And now, here she was, in front of strangers, sharing that love in a way she had never imagined. Her fingers moved almost automatically, guided by muscle memory and emotion, creating a melody that was both tender and powerful. Each note carried a part of her story, a part of her life that had been hidden for too long. The room was quiet except for the music, yet she could feel the presence of every guest. She could sense the way people shifted slightly in their seats, leaning forward to hear better. Captivated by the sound, there was curiosity in their eyes, admiration, and something that bordered on reverence. She realized that for the first time in a long time, she was truly seen, not as a waitress, not as someone who belonged in the background, but as a person with a voice, a talent, and a presence. The music became her language, speaking louder than words ever could. The melody grew more intricate, moving through variations of speed and rhythm. Her fingers danced over the keys with precision and grace. She could feel the energy in the room change with each chord. The initial amusement, the expectation of failure, had vanished completely. Now, there was respect, admiration, and awe. She glanced at the host out of the corner of her eye. He had stopped speaking, stopped moving, and seemed to be observing her with a mixture of disbelief and begrudging respect. She had turned his plan inside out without even trying to confront him directly. Her music had done it for her. The complexity of the piece increased, and she allowed herself to add flourishes she had practiced countless times in private. She remembered long nights playing alone, imagining an audience of one or many, letting herself become completely absorbed in the music. Each note was a reflection of that practice, that dedication. She could feel her confidence growing, and with it, her joy. This was no longer a performance she had to survive. It was a performance she wanted to share. She was no longer afraid of judgment. She was simply playing. Some guests could no longer hide their surprise. Their expressions changed as they whispered among themselves. "She's amazing," one said softly, almost afraid to break the spell of the music. Another nodded, eyes wide, clearly impressed. The piano had transformed the space, turning it from a typical wealthy gathering into a hall where a story was unfolding before their eyes. She felt the energy of their attention, not as pressure, but as support, a gentle encouragement to continue. The host tried to regain control of the situation. He spoke, attempting to interject, but his words were drowned out by the power of the music. It became clear that she could not be ignored or diminished. She was commanding the room in a way that he could not. Her music spoke of resilience, hidden talent, and the courage to face fear head-on. And in doing so, it demanded recognition. Every chord seemed to assert her presence more strongly, and the audience responded. Their faces lit up with understanding and admiration. She had become more than the role society had assigned her for the evening. The piece began to build toward a crescendo. Her fingers flew over the keys with increasing speed and precision. Yet each note was controlled and intentional. She allowed herself to become lost in the music, letting the audience witness her transformation. She felt the adrenaline of performing mix with the joy of creating, a heady combination that filled her with exhilaration. The crowd's reaction was tangible, a shift from polite attention to genuine awe. She could see it in the eyes of the guests, the way they leaned in, their hands hovering over the edges of their seats, fully engaged. Her mind wandered briefly to the life she had led until now. She thought of the long hours of work, the moments of self-doubt, the small sacrifices she had made for practicality and survival. All of it had led her to this moment. The piano, the music, the attention, it was all part of a story that was hers to tell. She realized that for every moment of hardship, every ounce of perseverance, she had grown stronger. And tonight, she could finally show that strength in the most beautiful way possible. The room was fully absorbed now. Guests were whispering compliments to each other, trying to understand how someone who seemed so ordinary could produce something so extraordinary. She noticed some holding their breath at particularly difficult passages, others closing their eyes to fully immerse themselves in the sound. The host, once the center of control and amusement, was now just another observer. His plan had completely failed, and it was clear to everyone that she had triumphed. As the music approached its final section, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Each note was deliberate, each phrase carefully considered. She had moved from fear to confidence, from hesitation to mastery. The room was completely silent except for the piano, and she felt a connection with everyone present, a shared understanding of the beauty and power of music. She realized that she had not only impressed the audience, but she had also discovered something new about herself. She had the courage to face fear, the talent to inspire, and the resilience to rise above judgment. The final chords rang out, lingering in the air like a gentle echo. She allowed the sound to fade slowly, savoring the moment. The room remained silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause once again, louder and more enthusiastic than before. People were smiling, nodding, and some even gave her standing ovations. She felt a mix of relief and pride, her heart racing, her chest full. She had faced ridicule and doubt, yet she had turned it into a moment of beauty and triumph. The host stepped forward again, clapping this time with genuine respect. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something softer, a recognition that he had misjudged her completely. Guests approached her, offering compliments, asking questions, and expressing admiration. Each word was a validation of her skill and courage. She realized that this night, intended to mock her, had instead become a turning point, Her music had transformed a simple party into a space of recognition and inspiration. As she stood from the piano, she felt a new sense of confidence. The fear that had gripped her at the beginning of the evening had been replaced by a quiet pride and a deep understanding of her own strength. She had faced the challenge head-on, and in doing so, she had revealed something extraordinary, both to herself and to everyone in the room. And in that moment, she knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that would carry her far beyond the expectations of anyone who had ever doubted her. The last notes had barely faded when a wave of excitement swept through the room. Guests were no longer whispering in surprise but openly praising her, leaning toward each other to remark on the unexpected talent of someone they had assumed would be unremarkable. The atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a cruel setup for ridicule had transformed into admiration and genuine amazement. She sat for a moment on the piano bench, breathing heavily, feeling the warmth of applause and the weight of attention. The strange mix of relief and exhilaration coursed through her, as if every nerve in her body was alive and humming with energy. The host, who had been the orchestrator of this moment, stood slightly apart, his arms folded, trying to maintain a semblance of control. But the smirk that had earlier dominated his face was gone, replaced by a complex expression that was difficult to read. There was surprise, certainly, but also a flicker of respect. He had assumed she would falter, that the crowd would laugh, and yet here she was, commanding admiration and applause without a word. He shifted uncomfortably, realizing that he could no longer shape the narrative of the evening. For the first time, he was witnessing someone take control of their own story, simply by being true to themselves. Guests began to move closer to her, some standing to shake her hand, others speaking in low tones of encouragement and praise. Their faces were lit with delight and awe. She could feel their curiosity and genuine interest, and it gave her a strange sense of empowerment. She had spent years blending into the background, working quietly without recognition. But this moment was different. People were not just seeing her, they were acknowledging her presence, her talent, and her courage. It was a sensation she had never experienced before, and it made her chest swell with pride. She stood from the bench, brushing her dress gently and taking a tentative step away from the piano. Conversation started to bubble around her, not in mockery, but in admiration. Guests asked questions about her musical background, how she had learned to play, and whether she had performed publicly before. Each question felt like a recognition of her skills, each compliment a validation she had longed for, but rarely received. She realized, in a quiet way, that this night was more than just a performance. It was a turning point, a moment when she could step out of the shadows and into the light. The host finally approached, his usual confidence replaced by a careful, measured demeanor. He extended a hand, not in mockery, but in a gesture of respect. "I must admit," he said quietly, "I didn't expect that. You have a gift, and I should not have doubted you." His words were uncharacteristically sincere, and she felt a flicker of surprise. He had been a figure of authority and intimidation all evening, yet now he was acknowledging her talent openly. It was a strange reversal, a moment where power shifted not through wealth or status, but through skill, courage, and presence. As she conversed with the guests, she noticed that the party itself had changed. The chatter, once focused on fashion and wealth, now revolved around music and talent. People were discussing the piece she had played, the emotion behind it, the precision and artistry of her performance. The room, once a symbol of social hierarchy, had become a space where her abilities were the center of attention. She could see it in their eyes, the way they leaned forward to listen, the genuine curiosity and admiration in their expressions. It was a rare feeling, one she had seldom experienced, being recognized not for who she served, but for what she could create. A few guests lingered by the piano, hesitant to leave, asking her to play another piece. Her heart leapt at the idea, but she also felt a trace of nervousness. Could she do it again? Now that the weight of expectation was heavier than ever? She took a deep breath and allowed her fingers to brush the keys lightly. The music began softly at first, gentle and deliberate, as if testing the waters once more. But as she continued, confidence returned, stronger than before. Her fingers danced over the keys with a new ease, guided by emotion and memory, weaving a melody that was both expressive and captivating. The host watched quietly, leaning slightly to one side, no longer attempting to dominate the room or the moment. He had planned to amuse himself at her expense, but the reality was far different. His guests were captivated by her, not him, and he was forced to accept that control had shifted. She was no longer just a background figure. She was the center of attention, the one who commanded presence and respect. It was a humbling experience for him, a moment where his assumptions and authority had been quietly challenged and overturned. As she continued to play, the crowd reacted instinctively. Applause broke out between passages, not out of politeness, but out of genuine appreciation. Smiles spread across faces, eyes widened, and a few people whispered among themselves in admiration. Each chord she struck, each flourish of her fingers, was met with recognition of her skill and dedication. It was as if the music itself had opened a door, transforming perception and expectation into acknowledgement and admiration. The crescendo of her piece built slowly, each note carefully placed, each chord resonating with power and emotion. She felt her own excitement growing with the music, a mix of exhilaration and a profound sense of self-affirmation. This was her talent, her voice, and she was finally allowed to share it without fear of ridicule. The room had become a witness to her strength, a silent audience to her courage and artistry. When she reached the final chords, she allowed the music to linger, letting the sound fill the space fully before fading gently. Silence followed, a brief pause as the room absorbed what they had heard. Then, as if released from some spell, the applause erupted again, more powerful than before. People were standing, clapping, and smiling, their faces reflecting the awe and admiration that had grown steadily throughout the evening. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not from fear or sadness, but from the sheer intensity of the moment, from realizing that her music had touched the hearts of so many. Guests continued to approach her, some eager to shake her hand, others offering heartfelt compliments. They asked about her musical training, whether she had considered performing publicly, and expressed amazement at her talent. Each interaction reinforced a sense of validation and recognition that she had longed for, but rarely experienced. The evening had begun with the possibility of embarrassment and mockery, but it had transformed into a celebration of her abilities, courage, and presence. The host remained nearby, observing, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet reflection. He had learned an unexpected lesson, that talent and courage could shift attention, respect, and admiration in ways that no wealth or authority could control. He watched as she engaged with the guests, answering questions with humility and grace, commanding attention without demanding it. For him, it was a moment of realization, an understanding that assumptions based on appearances or status could be entirely misleading. As the night progressed, she was invited to play another piece, this time with the crowd eagerly listening and supporting her. The experience was exhilarating and affirming, a confirmation that her talent was not just hidden in private practice, but could shine brightly in public. The joy of playing, combined with the recognition she received, created an unforgettable experience, one that reshaped her perception of herself and the possibilities ahead. By the end of the evening, it was clear that the power dynamics had shifted. The host's attempts to control or belittle her had been entirely upended by her skill and courage. Guests had moved beyond mere amusement to genuine appreciation, and she had stepped fully into a space that celebrated her abilities. The night had begun with fear and doubt, but it ended with admiration, validation, and the promise of opportunity. She realized that this was more than a single moment. It was a turning point, a first step toward a life where her talent could be recognized, appreciated, and shared with the world. The night was winding down, and the grand ballroom had begun to empty slowly. Guests were leaving in small groups, still talking about her performance, sharing their admiration and curiosity with one another. She stood near the piano, letting herself breathe after the whirlwind of music, attention, and emotion. Her hands were still slightly trembling, but it was no longer fear, it was excitement, a thrill she had never known. She realized that the evening had changed her life, even if she did not yet understand exactly how. People continued to approach her, thanking her for the performance and asking about her background. She explained softly, with humility, that she had practiced for years, mostly in private, and had never performed in front of such a large audience before. The reactions were always the same: astonishment and admiration. The words they spoke carried sincerity, and each compliment filled her with a quiet sense of pride. It was a validation she had longed for, but had never received so openly. For years, she had worked hard, kept her head down, and dreamed quietly. But now her talent had been witnessed and appreciated. The host came over, this time without the earlier smugness or pretension. He spoke sincerely, acknowledging that he had misjudged her and that her talent had exceeded all expectations. She nodded politely, recognizing the importance of the moment, though she did not need his approval anymore. His recognition was a formality. The real acknowledgement had come from the audience, from the admiration and respect she had earned through her skill and courage. As the last guests trickled out, some lingered by the piano, asking if she would consider performing again in the future. They spoke of potential opportunities, of venues and events where her talent could be showcased. She listened quietly, a mixture of excitement and disbelief filling her mind. These were possibilities she had never imagined for herself, doors opening in a world she had only observed from the outside. For years, she had believed her dreams were small, meant to be contained, but now they felt vast, reachable, and tangible. She sat once more at the piano, letting her fingers touch the keys gently. There was a strange comfort in their smooth surface, a reminder of the private practice and dedication that had brought her to this moment. She played softly, for herself, letting the music flow without concern for an audience. It was a moment of personal reflection, a chance to reconnect with the joy that had always driven her to play. The notes carried a sense of triumph, not over others, but over fear, self-doubt, and years of quiet perseverance. As she finished a simple, gentle melody, she felt a tap on her shoulder. A guest, who had been lingering near the door, offered a card with an invitation to perform at a local recital. Another handed her a note suggesting she record some of her music. She accepted them politely, her mind racing with possibilities. It was overwhelming, yet exhilarating, a tangible confirmation that her talent had value outside of private moments and casual applause. She had worked hard in silence for years, and now the world was noticing. Walking through the emptying ballroom, she noticed the subtle changes in the atmosphere. The staff who had been busy earlier were relaxed, exchanging stories about how the performance had captivated the guests. Even the chandeliers seemed brighter somehow, reflecting the sense of accomplishment and transformation that had taken place. She realized that her music had changed not just the perception of herself, but the experience of everyone in the room. A single act of courage and talent had shifted the energy of the space, creating an unforgettable memory for those who had witnessed it. The host approached her once more, offering a quiet word of encouragement. He admitted that he had underestimated her, and that she had demonstrated something far more valuable than mere talent: confidence, presence, and courage. She smiled softly, acknowledging the lesson he had learned. While understanding that her journey was only beginning, she no longer needed validation from him. The experience had proven to her that she had the power to shape her own narrative, to step forward and be recognized on her own terms. As she stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the grandeur of the ballroom behind, she felt a sense of renewal. The city lights sparkled around her, but they seemed different now, more inviting, as if reflecting the possibilities that lay ahead. She had taken a risk, faced fear, and turned an attempt at humiliation into an extraordinary opportunity. The memory of the performance, the applause, and the admiration would remain with her, a reminder of what courage and talent could achieve when allowed to shine. In the days that followed, she received messages and calls from people who had attended the party, expressing admiration and suggesting ways she could further her music. Invitations to small performances, local gatherings, and collaborations began to arrive. Each opportunity was a step forward, a chance to build a life where her music could be shared more widely. She embraced them cautiously at first, but the excitement of possibility was infectious, pushing her to explore beyond the familiar routine of work and private practice. Through it all, she reflected on the experience and the lessons it had brought. She had learned that fear and doubt could be transformed into strength when faced directly, that even when others expected failure, talent, courage, and authenticity could command attention and respect, that opportunities often appear in unexpected ways, and the key was to recognize and embrace them. And above all, she discovered the joy of sharing her gift, of connecting with others through music in a way that was deeply personal and profoundly impactful. She continued to play, both in private and in public, finding a balance between practice and performance, reflection and action. Each piece she performed, each note she played, was a continuation of the story that had begun that unforgettable evening. She was no longer simply a waitress moving quietly through the world. She was a musician, an artist, a presence whose talent could inspire and move others. The confidence she had gained from that night stayed with her, guiding her through challenges, encouraging her to take risks, and reminding her that the courage to step forward could change everything. Looking back, she realized that the night of the party had been more than just a single event. It had been a catalyst. It had shown her that her abilities, her passion, and her dedication mattered. It had taught her that recognition could come from unexpected places, that people could be moved by authenticity and skill, and that the power of music could transform not just an audience, but herself as well. The journey ahead was still uncertain, filled with possibilities and challenges, but she faced it with a newfound sense of purpose, knowing that the courage to share her gift could lead her to extraordinary places. And so, with her hands still warmed by the memory of the piano keys, she stepped forward into a future that seemed wider, brighter, and more open than ever before. The music that had once been her private refuge had become a bridge to opportunity, connection, and self-discovery. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the path ahead was hers to shape, and that with every note she played, she could continue to inspire, to create, and to be seen for the remarkable talent she had always carried within her.